Hello and good morning everyone, and welcome to the GDPR webinar. My name is Lorraine Moat and I'll be taking you through the presentation today. Just before I do that, I just want to take you through a couple of housekeeping points. So although you can hear us, we're not going to be able to hear you. Therefore, if you do have any particular questions throughout the webinar, please use the question function which you should find on the sidebar dashboard or control panel, which is provided by GoToWebinar. We will answer a selection of the questions at the end, but we may not be able to answer all in this session. Therefore, we'll be compiling an FAQ document with the answers, of course, which will be provided along with the recording of the webinar within the following week. And if you have any specific questions about your firm, we would, of course, be more than happy to discuss these with you offline. And there will be contact details provided to you at the end of the session, or you can reply to one of the reminder emails that you've been sent. Okay, so getting GDPR ready. So we'll be talking to you about some of the practical steps to getting GDPR ready and giving you some of the essential tips along the way based on our experience of working with our client firms. And for any of you that may not currently know TCC very well, we are a compliance firm specialising in bringing clarity to what often is complex regulation for our clients. And although GDPR isn't quite like the other FCA type regulation where we normally specialise, I think the tools and the techniques required to successfully navigate the changes are predominantly the same. So in that way, we feel that we're really well pleased to help our clients in implementing this GDPR. I just want to add at this point that we have actually created a preparedness assessment. It's to help you identify where you are in pursuit of your GDPR compliance, and the details of this will be emailed to you following this webinar, so make sure you don't miss out on that. So, just to formally introduce myself, as I say, my name is Lorraine Moat. I am a senior regulatory consultant with TCC, and over the last number of months, I've been working very closely with client firms across various sectors of financial services, helping them to understand their obligations under GDPR and to help them deliver a project to implement some of the technical and organisational measures that they need in place to help manage and track compliance with the new requirements. Joining us today in this webinar, we also have Andy Sutherland, our Managing Director of Advisory Services, and he will be on hand hopefully at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you may have as well. I just want to start first of all though by doing a brief overview of what the key changes are and that have been introduced by the new regulation, and I'll talk a little bit as well about how this impacts on small and medium-sized businesses. No doubt you're already aware of these changes already, however, I do think it helps to put everything into context before we launch into the practicalities of implementation. And I'll then talk about some of the common gaps that we as a firm have identified from working in similar firms. And finally, I hope to provide some insight into an implementation plan that we use for other firms and that we know works well. And this will include a review of some of the key IT considerations as well. So firstly, I think it's fair to say that one of the key drivers for the change in regulation is due to the changing ways in which companies now use personal data. And I think in particular the focus was on the bigger companies such as Facebook and Google and how they swap and access people's information in using their services, which wasn't of course foreseen when the original legislation was enacted. I think it's fair to say that the world in which we work in now has changed dramatically, and for example the world of social media has simply just exploded. So in short, the GDPR was introduced to give more people, or people more say, beg your pardon, over how the companies use their personal data. And it introduces tougher fines for those who fail to comply or who suffer a data breach. It also makes data protection regulation more or less identical across Europe. Therefore, any company who processes data belonging to an EU citizen will need to comply with the GDPR, even if they're based outside of the EU, meaning that UK businesses will still need to comply even after Brexit. And I think, just moving that forward, I think knowing, and you may already be aware that the government are in the process of transferring GDPR into the UK law through the data protection policy. They've issued a statement of intent for the data protection bill, which will bring our data protection laws up to date and provide more control to individuals. But I think their main objective here is to maintain trust, so that as a country we can continue to benefit from some of the economic and social gains of data innovation. They're also looking to future trade and our ability to transfer data across international borders and allow the UK to maximise the future data relationships with the rest of the EU and elsewhere. Security is another consideration for the government. Clearly the ability to continue to collect, share and process personal data for the security of our country and for law enforcement is high on their agenda. Throughout the data protection regulation, there's a big focus on accountability, and it's now an expectation on managers, senior managers in an organisation to ensure that they have responsibility and accountability for the data assets that they control. Data protection principles predominantly remain the same. They haven't really changed that much. The only change that I'd like to call out is the focus now on ensuring that we're only processing data which is considered necessary and for the purposes in which you've obtained that data. The definition of personal data has been simplified, however, what may be considered as personal data now is much, much broader. This can be any information relating to an individual, whether it's related to his or her private, professional, or public life. It could be anything from a name, home address, photo, email, address, bank account details, posts on social networking sites, etc. But it can also now be included in IP addresses or cookie strings. From the point of view of controllers and processors, I think the concept of controller and processors are essentially unchanged under the new regulation, but the respective obligations are significantly amended. Processors are now much more accountable and responsible in the same way as the controllers, and of course controllers have that additional responsibility to ensuring that their processors are complying with the regulation. In terms of the enhanced rights for individuals, individuals have more rights in terms of transparency, so having the right to the information in terms of what you're doing with their data, the right to have inaccurate or incomplete data corrected or amended, the right to restrict the processing where perhaps that processing is not necessary or whether it's not legal, the right to portability, which is entirely new and allows personal data to be received or transmitted to another controller in a structured, commonly used and machine-readable format. You have the right to object to automatic profiling where there's a decision based on that profiling. And of course the right to erasure, as we've known as the right to be forgotten, which now has its own article under GDPR. However, this right is not absolute. I just want to add that little caveat here, and only really arises where the controller has no legal ground for processing the information. In terms of special categories of personal data, this is what we would have once known as sensitive personal data. This again remains unchanged. However, there's two new categories of genetic data and biometric data that are added to that special category of personal data. Firms now need to identify and record their legal basis for processing the data. Now that can be quite commonly consent, but it can also be contractual or covered under a legitimate business interest or any other legal obligation that you may feel is relevant to your business. In terms of the breach notification process, this has changed whereby I think it's fair to say that previously there was no real obligation for anyone to report a breach, particularly, but now breaches are expected to be reported as soon as possible and certainly within 72 hours. And there is particular information that the Information Commissioner's Office would expect you to provide them. So this is a consideration as well if you're outsourcing to processors, to make sure that they are also advising you of any breaches in good time so that you can follow through with this 72-hour rule. In terms of the data subject access request, DSARS request, I think we all are aware that previously we could charge a £10 fee. This fee is no longer allowed to be charged unless it's a repetitive request or it's an unreasonable request. And instead of having 40 days to respond from the date of receipt, you now simply have 30 days. And I'm personally unsure of the impact of this particular change as to whether, as firms, you're going to start seeing an increase in the number of requests coming forward for that. Data protection by design and by default. This is really ensuring that at the planning phase of any processing activity and implementation phase of any new product or service, that data protection in terms of the principles and appropriate safeguards are addressed, considered and implemented, including identifying any risks and mitigating those risks accordingly. Where perhaps there may be high-risk processing, and I think you get a definition of what that is under section 4.3.1 of the regulation, where this is determined by the likelihood and severity of the risks to the individual, taking into account, of course, the nature, scope and context, as well as purpose of the processing. So high-risk processing could, for example, be the introduction of new technology, but where you're facing that high-risk processing, there's an obligation for you to complete a data processing impact assessment. In terms of ICO guidance, I'm going to just put it out there that I think there's been very little by way of guidance from the ICO thus far. The Article 29 Working Party have come out with a few bits of guidance for firms, but I think that many firms, certainly that I'm working with, are still quite unclear, as are we are, to be honest, as to where this is going to go. We're really hoping that by the end of this year, we'll have some further guidance from the ICO in terms of how firms are really expected to implement that and cleaning up some of the sort of unclear sections of the regulation for us. I said I would mention something about the impact on small businesses. Many of the small businesses I talk to naturally don't have the big budgets that bigger firms have. They don't have the resource to throw at this. They don't have data protection officers, and they ask me the question about, you know, how much do they have to implement in their world? And just by way of a quote from the Information Commissioner herself, she said that, well, she acknowledges first of all that small businesses tend to be less prepared. They do tend to have less to invest, and they don't have huge compliance teams, which is certainly reflecting what I've seen when I'm working with smaller firms. But she also goes on to say that small organisations still often do process a lot of personal data. Therefore, in her mind, the reputation and the liability risks are just as real. So for me, I'm reading into that it doesn't really matter what size your business is, within reason, you're still going to have to implement the requirements of the GDPR. There are, however, some potential exemptions for smaller firms. So, for example, where you are a firm that has less than 250 staff, there's no real requirement on you to keep records of your processing activities. Similarly, with the requirement for a data protection officer, this only really applies to public authorities where your core activities consist of processing that requires regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, or where your core activities consist of processing sensitive personal data, those special categories of data on a large scale. However, my advice to you and advice to any firm I'm working with is to keep a hold of the records of your processing, because I think it actually does help provide you with the evidence of that legal perspective of why you're processing that data, and evidence and rationale for your processing. Similarly, although you might not need a data protection officer, having someone within the firm that's a champion for your data management, I think, is definitely good practice. There are other regulatory considerations, and there's other regulations in the background that are coming to the fore very soon. One of them being the senior management certification regime, which is being rolled out to all authorised firms very, very soon. And whilst I'm certainly not going to be focusing on this regulation as part of this presentation, I think it's fair to say that combined, the GDPR and the senior management certification regime will reform the way in which you as a firm manage your customer data, and certainly how you govern the decisions that you make and how those decisions are recorded. So both pieces of regulation will require firms to evidence compliance, and will certainly transform the extent to which senior managers will be held individually accountable for their conduct. Another thing I'd like to just to focus on, as well as the FCA's principles for business that no doubt we're all quite familiar with. But I think that in terms of the GDPR, this complements the regulation, or they complement each other relatively well. So, you know, the principles around integrity and due care and diligence, organising and controlling your affairs responsibly, paying due regard to the interests of your customers, communicating in a clear way, and of course dealing with regulation. So in terms of the ICO's expectations, the ICO have already said that GDPR is a game changer, and they have come out and noted that they expect to be able to hold firms up as good examples of implementation. And I think what remains unsaid for me is that, considering the greater powers, both civil and criminal, that the ICO now have, I fully expect them to come up and hold firms up similarly as examples of poor compliance. So I think in terms of what the ICO's expectation is, I think they expect the GDPR in firms to develop a culture of privacy that pervades an entire organisation. Working with firms thus far, what I've realised is that there are quite a lot of common gaps now, just by way of a bit of comfort around all of this. Of course, you're going to have gaps. This is a new piece of regulation, and if you're already got all the the ducks in a row, then happy days. But most firms are still working through the changes and in updating the processes accordingly. I just want to talk you through some of the common gaps, just so that you can sort of benchmark yourself against these and or give yourself a bit of comfort in terms of where you are. The first thing I notice is around data assets. So most firms don't seem to be able to identify what data assets they're holding. They also don't seem to be able to verify, or they haven't certainly captured or evidenced their legal basis for processing each of those data assets. In addition, they've not recorded where the data assets are stored or who has access to them, which would make it very, very difficult if, for managing the data, particularly if you need to delete that data. And they don't appear to have recorded with whom the data is disclosed or shared, and in some instances we've discovered, or they've discovered, that in fact it's shared via a cloud application which is actually outside of the EU, or shared with a third party who processes it outside of the EU, which is a concern. Apart from your clients and customers, you also need to consider the data assets that you hold around prospective clients. Similarly, individuals within your firm, your HR records, they're individuals nonetheless, so the data protection requirements around that data is also the same as it would be for your clients and customers. The same would apply to any supplier information, your supplier contracts, and any third-party data that you may be processing. It's really important that you first of all get a grasp of what data assets you're processing. Other gaps that we're finding is that at this point in time, firms don't seem to have a defined accountability or responsibility, particularly at senior manager or line management level. There's a lack of governance items that talk directly to data protection, both within the risk registers or conduct risk dashboards. Not a lot of MI produced or analysis around how compliant they are. And of course, at this point, there's a lack of training and awareness. GDPR is new, and firms are just starting to begin to, I think there's a knowledge base at the senior management level, but below that, I think there's some work to be done. There are ineffective controls to mitigate and manage any risks related to data confidentiality and integrity, and some ineffective processes for managing the data breaches, particularly incident response, in line with new requirements. I think quite importantly, there is a severe lack of effective oversight and monitoring with adherence to even the current data protection regulations, if I'm honest, and I think that's both internally and across their third-party processors as well. Another common gap is around transparency. Naturally, your privacy statements, unless you've already started to look at those, will be out of date. So where you provide information to customers on what you actually do with that data and why you keep it, your declarations, your T's and C's, etc., will all need to be updated in line with these new requirements. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, if you use cookie strings or capture IP addresses, generally what we're finding is that we're currently non-compliant with the new regulation in terms of how you gain, capture and record that consent. The DSARS process is also out of line with new requirements and needs to be reviewed to ensure that you're in a position to be able to respond to any question you have within that 30-day time frame. Data accuracy and purpose limitation. Excuse me. There doesn't appear to be, in the firms I'm working with, much by the way of defined or proactive processing for ensuring the accuracy of the data held. Most firms are relying on their customers telling them reactively that my data has changed. So you might want to think of more proactive ways in which you can remind customers they need to keep you updated, whether that's messages on your website or within regular communications you send out to your customer base. There's either no data retention policy, or where there is, it doesn't seem to be put into practice, and that includes a consideration on paper files, which incidentally firms tend to forget that they have. They're locked away in storage somewhere. They've been there since 1976 and no one really knows what's in those boxes anymore. So there is definitely a piece here we need to look retrospectively as well at the data that you're holding. There are definitely system constraints, particularly relating to how you would use your systems to minimise, delete and anonymise the data that you held across the various formats and locations. Information security. Firms either don't conduct effective penetration testing on the threats and vulnerabilities of their systems, or where they do, they don't seem to evidence it and people don't seem to be aware of it. And I found a similar situation with the third-party providers as well. There appears to be some ineffective internet or email security policies and practices in place where there's no real controls over who can send what and where. There are ineffective use of encryption to protect personal data when they are sending it out. And a small issue, but I think an important one, is there's no classification standards policy. So, for example, ensuring that the documents that you're sending around your business are marked as either internal use only, private and confidential, etc. In terms of individual rights, like I mentioned previously, there are systems and other constraints associated with introducing these enhanced rights of the individuals from the point of view of making sure that you're in a position to be able to port that data adequately should you need to, and also how you would obtain, manage and record consent. There's ineffective processes for managing special categories of data, so that's your sensitive data, where I've seen a lot of instances where firms seem to think it's within their gift to choose if and when they record that sensitive data, which is absolutely not the case, and GDPR makes that very clear that you must have explicit consent, and there's only very few instances where I think you would be able to override that. Ineffective processes for capturing personal data relating to children. You might not feel it's relevant to your business. You've got to think of some of the accidental places where you might inadvertently capture the data of children, which in the UK, incidentally, is going to be anyone under the age of 13. And for that type of data, you're going to require the explicit consent of the parent or the guardian. Third-party management. A lot of businesses have third-party supplier or outsourced services policies in place, but some businesses just really don't know who the third parties are or what the kind of arrangements they have with them. There's certainly ineffective due diligence processes and standards, so across different functions there's different approaches to how you onboard a new supplier, particularly those that obviously you're going to be outsourcing data to, and therefore no centralised controls or standards to which the business should be applying. And naturally, as the contractual terms of a supplier, a third-party processing contract is changing under the GDPR, I would hazard a guess that your contractual terms are currently out of date and will need to be updated. There's certain prescriptive wording that needs to be in that contract to make it compliant with the regulation. Naturally, it goes without saying, of course, your policies and procedures are all going to be written to reflect the current data protection regulation. And of course, these are going to have to be reviewed and updated accordingly, as are any underlying sort of process or process maps or process documents. IT considerations. There's a number of IT considerations, and I think it's really important, therefore, that throughout this process that your IT department become one of your closest allies and friends as part of the data inventory and discovery as well as implementation process. So, for example, we'll need their input at process conception. We need to help you through the privacy by design and default at the beginning of a new system, a new process, because these are generally the individuals that are building the code behind that. Similarly, with data deletion, minimization, or pseudonymization, they will be the people who can help you build the code behind that to ensure that your systems can, in fact, adhere to that requirement. And as well as data subject, right to access, rectification, right to be forgotten, and data portability. So what I'm saying here is that your firms need to consider all the IT processes that both underpin and enable these processes. There will definitely be a requirement for IT functions to facilitate compliance. They will certainly be the people that should be helping you with your data mapping stroke inventory exercise, and to ensure that you retain an up-to-date picture of the data assets that you're holding. Data security measures, again, from an IT perspective, there should be robust information security policies and procedures. Your IT department should be helping ensure that the systems support the integrity of the data assets through effective information security practices, ensuring that your cyber resilience and penetration testing and monitoring is robust, and that you have the right application interface security controls in place. Ensuring that you have identity and access management practices that are robust. That's both physical access as well as system access and identity. And of course, your mobile security, whether that's a mobile phone or a laptop that requires to be encrypted. Just want to point out at this point that quite often I've found IT departments working through adherence with the ISO 27001. If anyone's currently accredited with that, then I think this is in your favour, because it certainly does complement the GDPR pretty well. The other things to consider in terms of IT input is your business continuity measures and plans, just to ensure the ongoing integrity of the data where you have a severe system downtime. And similarly, the subcontracting of any cloud service providers, Article 28 refers, and the integrity of that data transfer process. Just want to highlight one thing for your IT department you might want to bring to their attention. There is new legislation aimed at bolstering the defences of the critical infrastructure in the EU against cyber attacks, and this will be focusing on central sectors of the economy, such as banking and finance. I'm really unsure right now how that's going to be impacted by Brexit, but it's definitely something that you might want to explore further. So in terms of implementation, now that we know what the requirements are, I'm going to give you some insights to what you should be considering as part of your implementation project. First thing I think you need to consider here is your senior management accountability. Certainly, as part of the project, I would suggest that you gain senior management commitment to your implementation project. These are the individuals who generally have control of the purse strings and can release the right and available resource. Make sure that you've got the right governance arrangements in place to record, capture and evidence how you're complying with the regulation. And you may wish to reflect this in either your risk register or a data protection or conduct risk dashboard, whichever you may call it, so that you've got a means of continuously monitoring and reviewing your adherence with the regulation. In addition, as I've mentioned briefly, you definitely need to have the right resources in place, both financially, to make sure that you can implement. And a lot of firms are telling me that, of course, they haven't budgeted for it this year. My advice to them was, if you can, borrow from next year, because you're going to have to make this spend at some point, and leaving it to next year because you don't have the budget is going to cut it really fine in terms of making sure that you're ready for May 2018. Similarly, in terms of accountability and responsibility, I would make sure that you, as part of the project team, you've assigned accountability across all business functions, because all business functions have a responsibility for adhering and being responsible for the data assets within their area. And start educating the business. If you haven't done so now, I would suggest it's a good place to start. Make them aware that it's coming, and of course consider the ongoing education piece in your e-learning, workshops, however else you conduct that. And although you might not need or want to have a data protection officer, I also think that ensuring that as part of that project you have someone who is championing for the whole business your data protection measures. Mapping the landscape, as I mentioned previously about firms not knowing where their data assets are sitting. I think without a data map and inventory of what you have and why you have it, including capturing the legal basis for processing, then you can't go any further, to be honest. That includes understanding who has access to that data to make sure that they should have access to that data, or perhaps there is something you need to divulge to the data subjects. Consider data transfer, where you're transferring within the EEA, it should be fine, including Jersey and Guernsey and other areas that are recognised by the ICO as having adequate controls, and as privacy shield for the US. However, where perhaps you are processing data outside of the EEA, then you might have to start relying on things like binding corporate rules, which is a bit of a process in itself, so definitely worth understanding and considering. In terms of the gap analysis, therefore, so once you know where your data is and you know what you hold and why you're holding it, you then need to start looking at the actual particulars of the articles of the GDPR regulation. So considering your legal basis for processing, considering the accountability and governance arrangements, the breach management and reporting process, looking at your consent management, how compliant you are with the new requirements around that, making sure that a post-consent, which has to be as easily withdrawn as it is given, ensuring that your third-party processing, particularly the contract, reflect the requirements of the regulation, making sure your policies and procedures and privacy notices are up to speed, looking at your systems and controls for collecting, storing and deleting information, and looking at your data security. Also, I would consider looking at complaints management process, because individuals have the right to make complaints about the way in which you're managing their data, and of course consider your training and awareness programme. So look at where you are currently versus where you need to be in the new world for May next year, and that should give you a detail of the gaps that you have, which you can then start prioritising in terms of the risk to your business, or in fact the length of time to implementation is another reason perhaps for pushing that further up the priority scale. In terms of your technical and organisational management, you need to think about aligning your technical and organisational measures. So align your data breach processing, conduct data protection impact assessments when you have high risk processing, introduce a new process for data protection by default and by design at the beginnings of any new process or product that you're introducing, for example. Review and update your customer notifications, your privacy statements, your declarations, your T's and C's. Consider how the technical ability you have to minimise and to delete the data that you hold. Think about how you're going to respond to data breaches and the processes in place for that. How you're going to keep up with the data subject access requests, because the ICO have already said that not having the right resource in place is not going to be an excuse for non-compliance with that one. Consider having a written record of processing activities despite having less than 250 employees, and definitely look at the robustness of your technical information security. Update your policies and procedures, and give some consideration to your marketing and sales areas if that's relevant for your business, because direct marketing is certainly a bit of a grey area right now for GDPR. Hopefully about to get some clearer information on that. But you may want to consider what your legal basis is for processing when you're marketing to your clients or customers. In terms of your third-party processors, You want to start conducting due diligence. Where you feel that in the past this has been light, you might want to do a bit of a retrospective review of that. Review and implement the new contractual terms so that these are all signed and ready ahead of the May 2018 date. This will more than likely require a legal overview as well, as it is a contract, so it would be beneficial for you to have a legal eyes in terms of the legalities of the contract, and introduce a process of oversight and monitoring, so you've got that ongoing review of compliance to make sure that you're not just compliant from May, but you're compliant going forward, and that should be internally and also for your third-party processes. In terms of future-proofing and the post-implementation, so it's now the end of May 2018, and you think about what next? We've introduced a data protection by design default process, and that's now part of BAU. You're conducting ongoing monitoring and oversight, so you get a picture of how compliant you are on an ongoing basis. You've got a governance structure in place, which includes MI and reporting to the right governance forums. You maintained a training awareness programme. You kept records of your data processing activities. You keep some root cause analysis of any data protection complaints and feed that back into the business to improve the processes where you can. And you've maintained a data breach notification and response plan. So to sum up, this sometimes can sound pretty like doom and gloom and pretty bad news, but I think if you were to ask me if everyone's going to be ready for me next year based on what I've seen and what I've heard and the firms that I'm talking to, I think the answer to that quite simply is no. No one's going to be ready for next year, but as long as you are not doing anything reckless or careless with the data that you hold, because if you do, then expect to be fined. And I think if you look at the level of fines, which is now, I think the fine currently with the ICO is £500,000, and I think in general I think the average fine for firms has been up to now about £80,000, but if you extrapolate that into the new world from May next year, you can expect the average fine to be something around the region of about 2.2 million. It's a big jump, so there's no time to be complacent here or cut corners, but I think as long as you've got something in plan and you're working towards it and you're taking care meantime, I think you should be fine. You're not going to fall off the edge of a cliff come May 25th next year. You might not have the relevant expertise or resource capacity internally to meet your obligations, so it might be worthwhile looking outside for cost-effective options to help you get there in time for May next year. And of course, make sure that you've got the right financial and human resources as well. It can be costly, but I think it's a required investment. I want to end it here on a bit of a positive note. Personally, my personal opinion here is that GDPR to me makes good business sense. If you're taking care of my data as a customer, I'm going to have confidence in you as a firm. If you've got confidence in your customers, then your stakeholders and your board are going to have confidence in you as a firm. I think, therefore, you're going to engender more trust and confidence with the customers that you work for. So I think it's definitely a good business sense. It's definitely a good marketing tool to come out and say that you are GDPR compliant and that you take care of your customer data and you take compliance with the regulation very seriously. So I think it's just a little positive note to end on for you, because it does sometimes seem quite a daunting task ahead of us all, quite honestly. So hopefully that has been useful to you. I'm really happy to take any general questions that you might have right now. You can use the question tab in the sidebar, as I said earlier. But any questions that are unanswered will definitely be compiled into FAQ document with the responses, and we'll get them out to you as soon as we can. So happy if there's any questions right now that we can perhaps answer. Okay, so quite a number of questions here. Okay, so with regards to, someone's asked this question: do we need to get consent for processing our clients' and prospects' data? We're struggling to know how we can do this effectively and are worried we lose a lot of our data. Really good question. Something even internally we've been looking at. And for me, it really would depend on the relationship that you have with that individual. Again, it's something that we're hoping there'll be further clarity given by the ICO going forward. But I think in this regard, there may be instances where you may need consent, but I also wonder if you'd be able to rely on the legitimate business interest for processing. So, for example, does your prospect, is there an expectation on their behalf that you would be making that contact with them? Is it a relationship that you've currently got with them? Therefore, would your contact with them be totally out of kilter? Is your contact relevant to the business relationship that you have or are about to have with them? And if it is, then I think that you could potentially use legitimate business interest as a legal basis for processing. We have developed here a legitimate interest assessment, which is a bit of a kind of balanced scorecard. You answer some questions, they're all weighted, depending on what you get to at the bottom. The sort of form will tell you whether in fact you can or cannot rely on legitimate interest within reason as a legal basis. But it's definitely something, I think for this particular instance, it's something that you might want to look at and explore. And certainly, if there's any help we can give you with that, I'm quite happy to take that offline as well and discuss a bit further with you. Okay, in terms of the next question. So, how can we be sure that the legal basis we choose for processing our data is correct? Another really good question. One thing I would say here is that if there is a legal obligation, as an example, you may have a return to duty HMRC, you may have to process data due to anti-fraud or anti-money laundering regulation. That therefore will become your legal basis for processing. If you have a contract with an individual, then that will become so long as that person is party to that contract, your legal basis for processing. If you, as I was discussing previously, believe that you have a legitimate business interest and you can evidence that you've done your due diligence to ensure that in fact that is the right and legal obligation for you to process, then you use that. Otherwise, you're relying on consent, in general, you're relying on consent. And what you cannot do is you cannot circumvent the need for consent, because it's too difficult to get consent, or it's a bit too clunky, or it's just a bit troublesome. You can't therefore say, that's okay, I'm going to rely on my legitimate business interest. Absolutely can't happen. So you need to look at the reasons why you're holding that data. And if you don't have a contract with the individual, if you don't have that legitimate business interest that you can rely on, you can evidence, then you're going to have to be looking towards consent for that. And this is where I think it's really important that you're capturing within your data mapping process the legal basis for each data asset that you hold, because it may be contractual, in which case you are covered, or it may be something else that you require that person's consent for. And don't forget, the consent has to be clear, explicit, unambiguous, and can be withdrawn. One other little thing that I would want to say about that is that if you're relying on consent as your legal basis, remember that it can be withdrawn. Therefore, you need to think very carefully as to whether consent is the right legal basis for your processing. Next question. So, if we don't have the resources to do a comprehensive review and change program, what are the most important aspects that could get us into the most trouble? Really good question, that one. So I think it would be not having the right security around the data that you hold. It would be not being transparent, clear and transparent with your customers around what you're doing with their data. So if you're using data that in a way in which they're totally unaware, then I think you could land yourself in trouble. You need to be transparent, you need to be open, and you need to make it really clear to the individuals what data you're using, why you're using it, who's going to get to see it, how long you're going to keep it for. So I think transparency, and I think understanding your legal obligation for processing is really high in the agenda. But I think it's if you look at why most firms get fined and have been fined, it's been for two things. It's been for lack of security and lack of controls around protecting the data. So if you've got controls in place, and irrespective of those robust controls, someone's clever enough to go through a back door and breach your controls and therefore have access to your customer's personal data, you're not going to be held at fault of that. If you've done everything you can, it's a breach nonetheless, but you're not going to be taken to task over that. Similarly, I think you need to be sure that the data that you're holding is held for just as long as necessary. We've already seen examples where there was they were a small software gaming company who were fined, I think, £60,000 or £80,000 from memory for simply holding on to data that they no longer initial stages of implementation to make sure that you're not holding data that's unnecessary and that it's just the data that you're required to do your processing activities. So look at the security, look at your retention periods, look at your legal basis for complying, and look at your transparency in terms of what you're doing with that data so that it's totally clear to your customers. So let's see, we've got time for another question here. Will we need to get legal advice? If so, what on? Yes, potentially, yes. I mean, we're compliance experts, so in terms of how you comply with the regulation, I think that absolutely we can help you with it. I can also see there's instances where you will need some legal advice, perhaps and particularly around contractual elements of your, as I mentioned, I think during the presentation, with your processors, who you will need to change their contractual obligations. So I think it makes sense to me as that's a contract and not something that as compliance consultants we are overly familiar with, that gets a compliance or a legal view. I think there may be other instances where perhaps there may be some grey areas in terms of the interpretation of the regulation, particularly around legitimate interests, where you may wish to seek a legal opinion on whether your decision to use that as a basis is in fact a relevant one. You know, we can certainly help you in many ways around that, but there may be other grey areas just in that particular point that you might want to clarify with a legal expert. And again, I think another area is where you're trying to decipher the type of processing that you do in terms of whether you need to report, keep records of your processing activities, or whether you need a data protection officer. Again, there may be certain nuances of the regulation that might need a little bit of a legal overview. So I think there's a balance between compliance and legal in terms of your implementation. Okay, so I don't think we've got any more time for questions, but we've got certainly a number of questions that have yet to be answered. So we certainly will be compiling a response to those and sending those round to you. So firstly, just let me say thank you very much for listening today. There was quite a lot to get through and really have only touched on the surface. I could go on for hours on this particular topic. But hopefully you found the webinar useful and informative. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have created a preparedness assessment which it's free for you to take up to help you ascertain whether how far along that journey of preparedness you are in terms of the deadline, and we'll email you the link to take this assessment tomorrow, I believe. And we will then also email you the FAQs document and the relevant responses within the week. Please do get in touch if there's anything that you want to sort of talk about, or just want some comfort around, or just get some insight into. Our telephone number and my email address is there. I'm more than happy to take the call or to pick up separately if there's something more specific around your business that you want to cover. So just want to say once again, thank you very much for joining. Hopefully that was informative, and good luck everyone. Thank you very much.